It's great to be here in the midst of such an amazing sense of possibilities for the future. The future I'm here to talk about, is water. It's a subject close to my heart. Some people dream about flying. I dream about filling cathedrals with water and swimming through them. You could call it aquaholic. Today, I'd like to talk about the role design can play in making us more conscious of water. The water footprint is a good example, a really important issue for understanding not just global water consumption, but also how we as individuals consume water. But it tends to be communicated in really dull, uninspiring ways. We're all told that we should conserve water, cut down on the time of the shower, stop flushing, and so on. And of course, all that stuff's really important. But how much do we know about how much water each of us actually consumes? The first bit of the water footprint is straightforward. We use about 150 litres a day each for eating and drinking, washing, cooking, and flushing. But that's only the visible stuff. What we've done is made water invisible, made our water consumption invisible. And it's that hidden water we really need to think about. How much water do we wear? How much water do we sit on? How much water do we drive? And of course, how much water do we eat? On average, each of us here uses well over 4,000 litres of water a day for food and all the other things we can consume. So you can see that the sort of domestic use is a very small part of the whole. And many of the ways that we sort of use and abuse water today don't make much sense for the future. But the question is, what are we doing about it? Wonder Water is an initiative I started recently with Kari Korkman, Director of Helsinki Design Week. The idea is to develop projects aimed at raising awareness of critical global water issues. Our first project took place in September in Beijing Design Week. It's called Wonder Water Cafe, and it's a pop-up event about the water footprint and food. For a week, we took over Tian Hai, a small traditional Chinese restaurant in Dashilan, Beijing's historic district, and used their menu to show how almost unimaginably large quantities of water are needed to produce food. We'd put up these posters to advertise the event. And this is the Tian Hai's menu. We added stickers to show whether a dish has a high, medium, or low water footprint. And we put flags in the food. When the owner, Mr. Jia, sent his menu, I got a surprise. For a start, there were about 95 dishes. And we looked at the recipes, and most of them had 20 or 30 ingredients. A lot more difficult than calculating the water footprint of a hamburger. So we simplified it by taking a dozen of their most popular dishes, and I worked with the water department at Aalto University in Helsinki to calculate the water footprint. We produced a Wonder Water menu illustrating the breakdown for each dish and explaining how the water's used. Hang a heat of roast duck. That's really Peking duck. But who had any idea that it takes over 4,000 litres to raise a single farmed duck? That's probably roughly equivalent to the amount of water I'd drink in 10 years. Now, this is mainly used for growing the duck's feed, except for the pancakes. I think that's another 160 litres for wheat for pancakes. And that little pile of spring onions and cucumber, another 40 litres. Add the plum sauce, and that's how you get to the 7,412. Next, a seafood dish. That's around 1,500 litres, 1,250 just for raising the river shrimps. Again, the water's mainly used for producing the fish feed. Wild seafood has a much lower footprint than farmed. And then we've got a vegetable dish. Probably no surprise that vegetables tend to have a much lower water footprint than meat or fish. Tian Hai is a really popular neighbourhood restaurant, and the event drew quite a crowd. It was intriguing to see how people reacted and what dishes they chose, but what was really interesting was the conversations around the dinner table. It's not about scaring people with huge numbers, but rather raising awareness and offering alternatives. It isn't that a high water footprint is necessarily bad, but we need to look behind the figures and understand where this water comes from. Those delicious green beans may be grown in water-scarce Kenya. That cup of coffee I had this morning probably takes almost 140 litres of Brazilian water to grow and process the beans, and of course for transportation. What's happened is we've outsourced our water footprint, importing many water-intensive goods from other countries, often in the developing world. We really need to start thinking about the effect of the food we choose on the local communities where it's grown. We need to ask, whose water are we using for what? Does chocolate or coffee, a fruit, grain or meat have its water footprint in a region where water is scarce? Agriculture is well over 70% of the global water consumption, so what we choose to eat really can make a difference. And with concern over future food security and how we feed a growing population, this issue really is an elephant in the room. I can imagine a day when we have the equivalent of a fair trade label for water, and in the future too, you can be certain we'll be paying a lot more for water-intensive foods. So to talk a little bit about the role of design in this, design is no longer about producing a fabulous chair or bicycle. I think the role of design thinking can be more about stimulating the imagination and debate. Designers can be great communicators, helping us grasp the almost unimaginable. We don't claim to be water experts, but we're good at shaking things up. And sometimes it's small projects like Wonder Water that help us understand complex issues because they connect to our lives, help us experience an idea physically, and make real-life decisions. The next project I'd like to talk about is Surface Tension, the Future of Water, an exhibition I co-curated at the Science Gallery in Dublin. It's on until January. The Science Gallery is part of Trinity College, and what excited me here was the multidisciplinary approach. The selection is deliberately really broad, everything from engineers' solutions to artists' imaginings, from the local to the global, from mega projects to small touches that might make us stop and think about how we're actually using water. Together, I think what's interesting is they really begin to show how thinking about water is changing, and particularly the concerns of a rising generation. The first project is an unexpected and constructive take on something depressingly familiar, plastic pollution in the sea. I'm sure you all know about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a rubbish dump bigger than Texas, swilling about in the Pacific Gyre, somewhere between California and the shores of Japan. The plastic doesn't sink. It takes hundreds of years to degrade, but it's a problem that we've created in just a few decades. SeaChair looks at how this marine waste could be turned into a resource. The designers proposed turning a retired fishing trawler into a plastic factory and employing redundant fishing communities to harvest plastic from the sea and use it as a raw material for injection moulding. This is the trawler turned factory. This is what they call the Nerdler, a hand-powered machine that sorts plastic pellets from larger pieces of waste. It might sound rather ludicrous, but with the EU considering plans to pay fishermen for plastic bycatch, perhaps a floating factory ship that recycles marine debris might not be such a bad idea. In any case, the designers here are less about offering a large-scale solution than a ground-up approach, small actions that are about inspiring people to act. Another project that looks at cleaning polluted water, this time a practical proposal for regions with serious water issues. Water-related diseases account for the majority of premature deaths in the developing world. Usually there is neither the money or resources to construct and maintain the types of water treatment processes used in more industrialized countries. This project works simply by solar disinfection. Water's fed through the clear pipes, and sunlight, magnified via a reflector, literally cooks it clean. It was developed by a team of engineers at Trinity College and is already being used in Kenya. Unfortunately, not all these ideas work out as intended. The exhibition includes a case study by my co-curator Ralph Borland of Play Pump. Play Pump is one of the more high-profile projects of the last decade that attempts to tackle the problems of providing clean water in the developing world. On the face of it, it seemed like a brilliant idea, simple and emotive. Use the power generated by kids playing on a roundabout to pump water for village use. The tank carries the advertising billboards, and rental funds the maintenance of the pump. It captured the imagination of the West. You might have seen a gleaming new Play Pump in Terminal 5 when it opened. It was given an award for sustainable design by First Lady Laura Bush and attracted over $60 million in the US alone. But soon its failings became apparent. The case study shows that it would take kids playing through the night to pump enough water for the village. In fact, it turned out to be less efficient than the hand pumps it replaced. The billboards remain empty, as who wants to advertise there? It seems to me that this study is really important as it alerts us to the need to constantly review and evaluate. Another work from the exhibition, Pouch, is a very different approach again, a small idea for promoting water conservation by making us more conscious of water as we use it. Inspired by a cow's udder, you pull and squeeze the tip to fill a glass. So the water is drawn carefully rather than running freely as it does from a tap. Sustainability demands that we change our habits and tease out these new relationships with water, enjoy it in different, less wasteful ways. Lastly, high water line. One of the problems about talking about global issues like climate change is making them tangible, understanding what they might actually mean where we live. Artists can be good at coming up with imaginative ways to communicate these kinds of scenarios. High water line is designed to illustrate the effect climate change could have on our cities. The artist, Yves Mosher, first staged it in New York and drew a chalk line on the streets of Manhattan, 10 foot above sea level, to indicate the zone at risk of flooding. There are already areas of Brooklyn that are uninsurable. This weekend, she's restaging High Water Line in Dublin, and there she's working with local kids to draw the flood zone along the banks of the Liffey. By literally taking the discussion out onto the streets, Mosher stops people in their tracks, gets them to think and talk about the threats of climate change in their neighbourhood, on their lives. And I think this is a really important new role for designers and artists. Before we rush ahead to find solutions, we need to step back and think a bit more, take time for these conversations. The big problem at the moment is that we simply don't value water. We value other natural resources, oil and gas, gold and pearls, but we take water for granted. This has to change. Thank you.
For more big thinking about the future, go to iq2if.com.